Hi everyone, my name is Nick Page and I'm a trombone player at Rutgers University. I'm here to talk about some of the different compositional techniques used in Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. This piece was based off the 1001 Arabian Nights. Here I will play a few excerpts from the piece and analyze them in comparison to Middle Eastern compositional techniques. And we'll see that, as a whole, a lot of the techniques used in this piece are very different from the ones that are authentic to the Middle East. So, beginning, let's listen to the Sultan's theme at the very introduction to the piece. So this introduction used one compositional technique that's connected to the Middle East, but isn't necessarily only used by the region. So that melodic line that you just heard used a whole tone descending scale as sort of the outline for the melody. And although that's found in certain Middle Eastern styles of music, it's also fairly common in Western and European music as well, which sort of takes away any uniqueness that it might have. In addition, I think it's worth noting how Rimsky-Korsakov portrays the Sultan as a very stern figure with that musical motif in the beginning of the piece. Much like the way, if you read about Mehmet Ali Pasha in All the Pasha's Men, sort of that Orientalist view of sultans in the Middle East as these dark, mysterious, stern figures, which may or may not reflect how they actually behaved and acted. So that's one of the first examples of misrepresentations that we could see in this piece. But moving forward, we could pay attention to the melodic motif that Rimsky-Korsakov uses to represent Scheherazade. So that melody used to represent Scheherazade is sort of an interesting case. Now, a common theme in Middle Eastern compositional techniques is the use of quarter tones and not equal tempered scales. So what this means is in the Western and European styles of musical composition, there are primarily whole tones and half tones, which specify the amount of frequency in between each pitch. In Middle Eastern music, however, there are other pitches that are used commonly in music that occur between Western ones. To people more familiar with Western classical music, these would sound really out of tune, but it's still a traditional compositional technique throughout the Middle East. Now, what's surprising about this motif that Rimsky-Korsakov uses is that the violin is one of the few European instruments that is able to play those quarter tones and is able to play notes in the same tonal systems that are used throughout the Middle East. That's why it's a little bit surprising that in a piece used to represent the Middle East that he chooses not to use the capabilities of the violin. The violin does have that unique property because of the way the instrument's designed. You could hit every frequency along the whole range of each string, even ones that aren't normally parts of Western classical music tonal systems. So it's almost a little disappointing and a little bit misrepresentative that he chooses not to use them. So moving on, there's another example in the piece. We'll look at the bassoon solo in the second movement. So now this is very different compared to the violin solo that we just heard, because the bassoon is a Western instrument that doesn't have the same capabilities of the violin to play Middle Eastern style music. Since the bassoon is designed with keyholes specifically for pitches in the European tonal system, it makes it impossible to play authentic Middle Eastern music on the instrument, which again makes an interesting question why Rimsky-Korsakov would try to represent Middle Eastern themes and culture with music and instruments that were totally incompatible with this. And that sort of plays into the Orientalist view that was common at that time throughout Europe. Rimsky-Korsakov wrote this piece approximately 91 years after the French expedition in Egypt. So that was a time when misconceptions about the Middle East were running very rampant throughout Europe. So now the next excerpt that we'll listen to is a trombone, an example of chromaticism in the trombone section. An example of chromaticism in the trombone section. So in that example, we're listening to another instrument that has the same capabilities as the violin, where it can play those quarter tones that don't normally exist in Western classical music. I mean, again, Rimsky-Korsakov chooses not to utilize them, but at the same time, chromaticism is also something that's common in certain Middle Eastern musical genres, which makes that a little bit more authentic while still adhering to the Western classical norms that Rimsky-Korsakov was familiar with. But since we've been talking about scales quite a bit, I think it's important to compare some common scales in Western classical music compared to Middle Eastern music. So the first thing that we're going to listen to right now is an example of the C major scale, which is one of the most common scales in Western classical music. So this C major scale is based off of the fundamental pitch C, and that's the same pitch that this next scale that I'm going to play for you is based off of, called the Rast. Now, to someone who's more familiar with Western classical music, the second scale that I played for you sounds almost grossly out of tune. That's surprising, being that both scales that I played originate from the same starting pitch, but the Rast scale, which is unique to the Middle East, uses those additional quarter tones that I mentioned are not commonly found in Western classical music. That's why to European and American listeners, something like that would sound really out of tune, even though that's another natural musical style throughout the Middle East. I think that brings up an important commentary, too, about how our perceptions of music are incredibly based off of the environment that we grew up in. Of course, our perception of music here in the United States would judge something like that as out of tune, mainly because it's very different from the common pitch notation systems that we are used to. So, having said that, I'm going to play another excerpt from Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, followed by a piece that's based off of the Arabian Rast scale. So there's an example of a piece of music based off of Western classical scales, and now here's one based off of the Ras scale. So again, to Western listeners, a lot of the pitches used in that piece sound really out of tune, but that's, again, something that's more so based off of our background and our perceptions of music theory. But again, more important commentary is found in that about how grossly Rimsky-Korsakov misrepresented the music of the Middle East in his piece. It's surprising that for someone who was trying to represent the region and in a story-like manner to the people of Europe, that he would completely ignore the actual compositional techniques that they used throughout the Middle East. So the final excerpt that I'll play for you is the return to the Sultan's theme in the finale of Shahrazad. So there we see another example of Orientalism in Rimsky-Korsakov's piece because of how he portrays the Middle Eastern Sultan as a very foreboding figure, which sort of plays into Europeans' fairy tale, timeless perceptions of the Middle East. But since that's section of music coincides with the finale of the piece, I want to take a few moments to discuss this actual recording that I've been playing for you. So the recording that I've been playing was from the Vienna Philharmonic back in 2005. And the reason why I want to take a second to note this is the Vienna Philharmonic was one of the orchestras that forbade women to be permanent members for the longest amounts of time. And it wasn't until 1997 that the orchestra allowed its first female permanent member to be accepted into the group, a harpist. So that's worth noting because since the piece is centered around the idea of a Middle Eastern woman, it's surprising that it was played entirely by a group of white European males. So that again begs the question of how could this group of people accurately represent a culture that they might not have had as much experience with, and a character whose gender was completely different from their own. As mentioned before, this fits in with the whole perception of the Middle East in European classical music. I mean, Rimsky-Korsakov even stated in his autobiography that one of his goals in this piece was to leave the listeners thinking about a Middle Eastern, Oriental fairy tale-like story. So, although he may have achieved that to the ears of European listeners, that doesn't ignore the fact that he completely misrepresented the region of the Middle East, which is sort of sad and fits into this whole context of globalization, like slowly more traditional musical styles, not just in the Middle East but around the globe, are being drowned out by European influences, European musical influences spreading around the globe. And although this is a very unfortunate occurrence, with globalization on the rise, it doesn't appear to be stopping anytime soon. But thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this podcast, and I hope you all left with some worthwhile knowledge about Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade and the portrayal of the Middle East in European classical music. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.